What's up, guys? It's Talon. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about whether or not it's better to play early game champions or late game champions in Wild Rift. Now, one of the reasons I'm making a type of video like this, one, I think it's an interesting question and I feel like it's talked about somewhat frequently on my stream, but also the new season is approaching in about like a week and a half, 2 weeks. And I think during that time, it's important to try to have some type of idea of your champion pool, and this might give you an idea of what type of player you are or kind of what types of champs you want to lead towards in the new season. So anyways, let's just get right into talking about the strengths and weaknesses of each. I'm going to talk about kind of the early game first and then late game after, and then we'll sort of conclude at the end. But starting off with early game champions, one of the main things that I really like, and personally I'm a player who plays a lot of early game champions, is the early game champions, they can really control the game a lot more because you're able to impact the game from minute one. As an early game champion, you know, as soon as your lane phase starts basically, or jungle if you're a jungler, you can pretty much immediately start impacting the game because you can get pressure in your lane, use that pressure to either kill in lane and get a big gold lead, rotate, help your teammate at scuttle, early objectives, all of these types of things. You can help just in general a lot more in the early game and have a lot more impact quicker. And then if you're able to get that impact early and get a lead, then you end up becoming really strong in the late game just because of the fact that you have so much more gold. Additionally, it's a lot easier to stomp worse players on early game champions because you have a bigger lead quicker. Whereas if you're playing a late game champion, say you're playing Syndra, right? It's going to be pretty hard to necessarily solo kill a Lucian early game, even if he's a really bad Lucian. Whereas if I'm playing Jason to a bad Lucian, even though Lucian's a good early game champion, I'm going to be able to stomp him because I have a lot more early game pressure in that type of matchup. And so it just allows me to abuse worse players quicker. Whereas if I'm on a late game champion, I kind of have to be patient, rely on my team to not necessarily fall too far behind. And then I'm going to be able to punish the Lucian's, you know, skill discrepancy later on in the game. So it really does depend kind of on what you prefer. You could also be a lot more aggressive, a lot quicker on early game champions. So you're able to play, you know, just to make like a lot more aggressive plays. So if you're a player who really likes being aggressive, really likes making a lot of things happen, you don't like waiting around. Basically, you have less patience and you kind of prefer just being able to find a lot of angles to make a lot of plays, and you want to have more potential to sort of just be able to do more things as a whole. Oftentimes, early game champions are going to be a lot better for this as well. Additionally, you can, you know, be more proactive, which kind of is along the similar lines to what we spoke about in terms of just being able to make more plays. You just get the decision making to do what you kind of want to do, basically. But the kind of negatives with early game champions are it's very easy to throw a game. Like, say that you start a game off 7-0 on an early game champion, and then you one time you die to the enemy, you know, like Vayne or a carry champion who's a late game champion. You give them 1,000 gold, they're able to take a turret, get, you know, a gold bounty on the turret, whatever. And just from that one play alone, you can pretty much lose an entire game because now they have a fed late game champion and you're just not going to be as effective later on in the game as they are. So it's a lot more stressful and you really have to like avoid making mistakes early, but it does kind of give you more agency to really make more decisions and kind of do what you want to do, control the game quicker. So it certainly depends on what type of player you are for whether or not you prefer that. Whereas if we go into late game champions, these are a lot more safe and kind of, I would say, almost more relaxing to play. You don't have to do as much in the early game. You can often be safe by just managing your wave, you know, relatively safely and just kind of letting your team you know, do what they're going to do. And as you just know, you know, you get to your 3 items, you get to the Elder Dragon fight, whatever, you know you're going to carry, and you're going to be in a position to really impact the game there. Now, the negative of that is sometimes you don't get to the late game because your team loses so hard. So if your team is, you know, you have all losing lanes, right, and you're a late game champion, it's going to be very hard to actually make that game a win. Whereas, say that you were an early game champion with all losing lanes, it's going to be a lot easier to actually cause an almost unlosable game to become a win. So basically, late game champs have more unwinnable games, but they have less ability to throw because since you're going to be so strong in the late game, even if you die one time, you're going to be able to come back in the late game if you have a lot of gold and you're strong and whatever. Whereas early game champions, they have a lot more like losable games, but they also have a lot more games where they can kind of make an unwinnable game become a win. So it kind of depends on where you find the frustration or where you find you often lose for what type of champs you would want to choose as well. Another thing about playing late game champs, your team will tilt more because more often than not, you're not going to have a huge lead early game, which is going to lead to, again, if your team does do bad in the early game, they're going to get more tilted and they're going to oftentimes want to end up throwing or doing these types of things. And it's going to be a little bit harder to control your team's mental. Whereas if you're an early game champion, oftentimes you having that additional lead will kind of boost the team morale. So generally speaking, again, these late game champs, they're safer, they're more consistent. If you're a really consistent player who likes just making the safer plays, then late game champs might be more for you. If you're kind of an early game player who prefers to sort of play really hyper aggressive and really make a lot of plays and have a lot of agency, then you might prefer early game champions, generally speaking. Okay, so I pretty much spoke about what the advantages and disadvantages are to playing each style and what type of players might like to pick it. But obviously you don't have to only play late game or only play early game champions. Like, even though I play a lot of early game champions, I still play Ziggs, and he's a late game champ, and I really like playing him. You know, you don't have to always only pick your champion based on whether they're good in the early or late game. So I think it's also important to mention when you should pick each type of champion. So for example, I play a couple different types of junglers. I play some Diana and Camille, who are more late game junglers. I play some Vi, Xin Zhao, Volibear, these types of champs. They're more early game junglers. So what am I going to want to pick, you know, a Volibear, a Vi, a more ganking, aggressive type of jungler, for example? Well, I'm going to want to pick that when I have a lot of more like passive or late game lanes, because I know if I'm able to get those late game champions to the late game, they're going to carry me. And so we just need to have that strength in the early game. So it's kind of important to have a balance of early and late game. You know, if you have a lot of late game in your team, pick that early game to get your people through the late game. And then, you know, if you have a lot of early game champs on your team, pick that late game so that it's easier to not just, you know, make one throw and then die. Now, you could pick a full early game comp, and that's still going to be fine. And a full late game comp, it's just going to be more, you know, difficult to get through whatever point in the game your team has a weakness. And so generally, it's kind of nice to draft in a way that leads to having less weaknesses. But you can also definitely draft to just play towards your strengths. You're just going to obviously have to really over-index into that part of the game where your team does have the strengths. And ultimately, it's just important to take advantage of your power spikes, of your strengths. Each champion is unique in every individual game. For example, Jace is one of the best scaling champions in the game if he's into a full squishy comp. But he's one of the worst scaling champions in the game if he's into a full take comp. So, like, it totally depends on the individual game for even whether or not your champion is strong in the game, early game, late game, all of these different types of things. A lot of context is required. And this is more just a general video to give you an idea of maybe what type of player you'd be, what you might gravitate towards, because I certainly find for me, my champion pool really consists of early game champions because I love having control over the game. I feel like I don't want to rely on my team to really be making a lot of the plays. I'd rather be the one who gets to control from minute one, so I don't have to rely on my team to really get me to that later part of the game. But if you're someone who really knows that they're going to consistently perform well in the team fights, because that's another thing, I'm not a very good team fighting player compared to my other parts of my game, which is another reason having those lane phase focused champs is good for me. But if you're, you know, a player who really excels in team fights, you're really good at spacing, or, you know, like, you just really pop off in those team fights, then you might want to play a late game champion. So I think that's kind of the main conclusion for the video. There's advantages to each. I don't think one is better or worse than the other in terms of solo queue. I think it depends on what type of person you are, what type of player you are. I've seen players who play a majority late game champions be able to climb to the highest ranks, and same with early game champions. I don't think there's necessarily one that is overall better than the others. The season is coming to an end soon, within the next, I think, 10 or 12 days. So again, I'm going to have a lot more content, especially the week leading up to and the week of the first week of the season, really about how to climb and how to get to your next, you know, peak rank in the next season. So definitely stay tuned for those types of videos. And if you want some additional help there, I have coaching as a rank 5 sovereign player for just $15 an hour if you DM me on Discord at Talon1169, or through the link in my description of any of my YouTube videos. You'll find the link to my Discord there as well. So if you're interested in that, let me know. If you have any questions that you want or any things that you really think will help you guys climb for the next season, definitely let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.